Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekend reading report. It's time for my weekend reading report, the spellbinding program where I talk about all the stuff that I read during the previous week. And last week was the last week of August. Thank goodness, because August for me kind of sucked. It's not been a good month. It's been a rough summer, but August has been particularly rough. But it's over now. It's over. And I have Cimmerian September to look forward to. Cimmerian September has finally arrived, Roger. A month devoted to Robert E. Howard and his greatest creation, Conan the Barbarian. This year, for Cimmerian September, we are reading Conan pastiche fiction. Unless, of course, you haven't read the original Conan stories by Robert E. Howard. If you haven't read those, read those. That's the real stuff. And we devoted September last year to reading Conan, the original Robert E. Howard Conan. And this year we're reading pastiche fiction. And what Roger and I are reading are the 12 books that were originally published by Lancer and later by Ace, edited by L. Sprague de Camp, that presented Robert E. Howard's original Conan stories, but mixed it all up with pastiche fiction by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, and changed the order and edited the story. I mean, it was not the way to experience Conan for the first time. But for many of us, it was the way we experienced Conan for the first time, because that was the only way we could back in the olden days. Let's take out my list here for the 500 book challenge. The challenge where I have to read 500 books that I own before I'll buy any new ones. The never-ending challenge that has gone on forever and will continue to go on forever. What number are we at? Well, okay, actually, let's hit number 175, because that's where we left off last week, with 174, which was the Fantastic Four, The Coming of Galactus. Fine piece of literature, which I highly recommend. Then we're at 175. 175 was Conan of Samaria, from that very series I was just talking about. Conan of Samaria. This is a fantastic cover from Frank Frazetta. He just did amazing covers for this series. And this is a painting that was done by Frazetta for this cover, which illustrates the story, The Frost Giant's Daughter, which was a great Robert E. Howard Conan story, which is featured in this volume, along with some other Robert E. Howard stories and some stories by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, which were not as good. In fact, let's see. So The Curse of the Monolith started off this volume, which was by de Camp and Carter, which was actually a pretty good story. Some of their stories are pretty good, and that was pretty good. Then we got The Bloodstained God, which was an historical story, which Robert E. Howard, it was an historical story written by Robert E. Howard that L. Sprague de Camp turned into a Conan story. He did that with a few stories that, at the time these books were published, were still unpublished. And he took those historical stories and changed a bunch of names, made the hero, whoever it was, into Conan, and introduced a supernatural element. And the supernatural element that was introduced in The Bloodstained God, I don't think he did such a great job in this particular story, introducing the supernatural element. It kind of stood out from the story as kind of a weird thing that didn't really seem to fit completely. It just felt tacked on, frankly. But, you know, it worked okay. It worked okay. But then we get The Frost Giant's Daughter, which is a Robert E. Howard story, and it was great. We get The Lair of the Ice Worm by de Camp and Carter, which is just okay. It's like, it's all right. And then we get a magnificent story, Queen of the Black Coast by Robert E. Howard, which is one of the greatest Conan stories ever written. And is one of Robert E. Howard's greatest stories, Queen of the Black Coast, which is where Conan meets the pirate queen Belit and joins her pirate crew for a while before tragedy strikes. Tragedy had to strike, right? Conan can't, you know, end up, you know, in love for any long period of time. You know, he's Conan. He has to start the next adventure with a new girl. It's just the way it works. Then we have The Veil of Lost Women, which is probably, The Veil of Lost Women could be Robert E. Howard's worst Conan story. Still better than the L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter stuff in the book. But there's one section of that towards the end, which is really effective. So it's a flawed story, but there's some good stuff in that story. Then we have a story called The Castle of Terror by de Camp and Carter, which is so forgettable that after I read the 12 books and look back on this series, I'll be going through the contents and going, what was that story about? I don't remember, and it frankly doesn't deserve to be remembered because it wasn't that good. Then we get The Snout in the Dark, which was, I believe it was an outline. It was a fragment and an outline that Robert E. Howard wrote. So it was an unfinished Conan story, which de Camp and Lynn Carter finished, and it was okay. It was pretty good. So the flaws of this series are very apparent in this book, in that you have Robert E. Howard's stuff and all this other stuff mixed in, which just isn't as good. I mean, the Queen of the Black Coast just dominates the rest of this book. It sits right in the middle of this book, and it's so far superior to everything else that it's just glaring when you read the L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter stuff that's next to it in the book. It's just, there's a stark difference. So the entertainment value of this book is high, because even the pastiche stuff is fun and it's entertaining. It just shouldn't be, as I keep saying every week, it shouldn't be mixed up with the Robert E. Howard stuff. For the life of me, I don't know why he couldn't just, L. Sprague de Camp, couldn't just present the Robert E. Howard stuff on its own in a series of books and then continue on with the pastiche fiction if that's what he wanted to do. Because that's what ended up happening anyway. Oh well. Altogether, pretty good book. It is what it is, you know. Then, time to turn the page on my 500 book challenge, because we are at book 176. Book 176, which is a book called The Weird Tales Boys. The Weird Tales Boys by Stephen Jones, which was very kindly sent to me by a viewer. And thank you very much for sending this book to me, because I did have a really good time reading it. It's a pretty good book, The Weird Tales Boys. You know, I was on Goodreads, and on Goodreads, you have to give everything star ratings. And I suck at giving star ratings. I suck terribly. I give everything 4 stars. I mean, whether it deserves it or not, usually. It's always 3 or 4 stars, but usually 4. And I gave this one 4 stars, which is probably too high, frankly, for this book, if I'm being honest. Probably a 3-star book if we're throwing around star ratings. It's pretty good, though. And if you are unfamiliar with the Weird Tales Boys, the big 3 of Weird Tales, then this is an excellent introduction to these writers. So this book is all about H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and Clark Ashton Smith, who were the big 3 writers of Weird Tales back in the 1920s and 1930s. And they were the greatest writers who wrote during that period on Weird Tales, although there were a lot of really great writers who wrote in Weird Tales. A lot. Robert Bloch, Fritz Leiber, a whole bunch of great writers wrote in Weird Tales. But these were the big 3. And so this is all about the big 3 and their time writing on Weird Tales, and a little bit about Weird Tales, the magazine itself. And like I said, if you don't know anything about these guys and don't know anything about their lives or their time writing on the magazine, then this is really interesting. It's a good introduction. There are some issues with it, though, I think. First of all, it could have been longer. It's fairly short. How far does this go? It's 246 pages, so it's brief for the subject that it's trying to encompass. So it's very brief and at times kind of sketchy. You know, not sketchy as sketchy, but, you know, it's just... There's a lot of blanks that need to be filled in. And so this could have been a lot longer. It could have given you a lot more detail on these authors, their lives, and also their relationships with each other. This does talk about how they were all pen pals with each other. They never met each other in actual life, but they wrote each other a ton of letters. But the contents of those letters, we don't really get much about. So we get very little about, like, the big debate about civilization versus barbarism that Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard carried on for so long. So there's not much information there. Also, Stephen Jones does take some shortcuts here and there. This is not a scholarly work, I should say, right up front. There are no notes. There are no footnotes. There are no sources in this book. So you cannot consider this a scholarly work. And it does things like, let me go to the first chapter on Lovecraft. Here we are. Our first chapter on H.P. Lovecraft does have some great photos and great illustrations from Weird Tales in this book, which I was pretty happy with. You get a lot of these line drawings from the Weird Tales magazine, which is excellent. But it talks a little bit about Lovecraft and his parents. And it says here, let's see, Lovecraft's mother, Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft, returned from Massachusetts with her nearly 3-year-old son to live in her parents' home. This is after Winfield Scott Lovecraft, Lovecraft's father, died. Apparently, he had a nervous breakdown while alone in a hotel room and was committed to an insane asylum. Winfield Lovecraft died 5 years later, aged just 44, of tertiary neurosyphilis. So it says here that Lovecraft's father died of syphilis, which is almost certainly true, but we don't know that. That's the thing. He states that as though it were a known fact, and it is not. We don't know for sure that that's what he died of. There was no diagnosis of syphilis, no medical diagnosis that is available to us. S.T. Joshi, in his biography, I Am Providence, The Life of H.P. Lovecraft, does give a really good argument for Lovecraft's father dying of syphilis. All the symptoms are there. He almost certainly died of syphilis. But like I said, we don't know that for sure. This is speculation. He could have died of something else. So that is not a fact. And if he had just said he probably died of syphilis, that would be fine, because he probably did. But I think when you're dealing with reality, when you're writing a biography or a nonfiction book or a history, the limits of our knowledge should be acknowledged. And this is something that we just don't know. This is speculation. It's an educated guess, basically, but we don't know. And it makes you wonder about some other things in the book. There's some information on Clark Ashton Smith, for example, and I don't know as much about Clark Ashton Smith's life as I do about Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft. I know a ton about those guys because I've been reading about them forever. But there's less information out there about the life of Clark Ashton Smith. And so there's a lot of stuff in here about Clark Ashton Smith, but I, as a reader, now I'm going to wonder, how solid is this information? You know, I don't know. I can't even check a source because no sources are listed. So like I said, it's a good read. It's interesting. You just have to wonder about that kind of thing. You know, how solid is the information that you're being given in this book? From what I've seen for the Robert E. Howard and the H.P. Lovecraft information, most of it is pretty solid, although it is kind of brief and sketchy. You know, there's just not enough to it, I think. It's good for an introduction. Also, another thing this book does is that towards the end, where it's talking about different book publications of these authors, films that have been based on these authors' works, it kind of turns into a written out bibliography in a way. You get these endless lists, for example, of Lovecraft films, you know, and then it just lists all these movies without actually talking much about the quality of the movies themselves. And so it just feels like a written out bibliography. And we could have used more criticism of the films themselves, more information about, you know, are these movies any good? It's still interesting, and you are going to find out stuff that you probably don't know. There are films and books in here listed that I didn't know about. And so that's cool. This just, I feel like, could have been better. It's good, but it could have been better. So there's that. So that was book 176. What am I reading right now? Conan the Freebooter. I am continuing on with this series, of course, because I'm going to read all 12 books. I'm on book 3, so I'm starting Cimmerian September ahead with already reading books 1 and 2, and now I'm on book 3. And I'm that far into book 3, and it's really, really good, probably because most of the stories in here are from Robert E. Howard. It started off with a story called Hawks over Shem, which is another one of those historical stories that L. Sprague de Camp turned into a Conan story. It was originally a story written by Robert E. Howard called Hawks over Egypt, which is available now. You could read the original. And if you have read the original, it's kind of weird to read it as a Conan story because the story reads so obviously what it is. It's an historical story that took place in a certain place at a certain time. But names have been changed so that it's now in the Hyborian Age. And with the main hero, sometimes Conan seems a little off, which makes sense because the main character in the story is not Conan. It was turned into Conan. So it just feels very much like what it is. A non-Conan story turned into a Conan story. It's pretty good because most of it was written by Robert E. Howard. So as far as action and pace and everything, it goes pretty well. There is a supernatural element that was added to the story, but this time L. Sprague de Camp actually does a pretty good job with that. And then you're moving into Black Colossus, which is the story I'm reading right now, which is one of Robert E. Howard's greatest Conan stories. It's just fantastic. And then we get Shadows in the Moonlight by Robert E. Howard. Then we're going to get The Road of Eagles, which is another historical story written by Robert E. Howard that was turned into a Conan story by L. Sprague de Camp. And this closes out with A Witch Shall Be Born by Robert E. Howard. Another great Conan story. So this is actually going to be a really good volume. And it's been entertaining so far. So, you know, as I've said, reading along, I could see why these books were so popular, particularly if this is the only way you could get Conan, which for a long time it was. It is what it is, though, as far as the mixing up of pastiche fiction and altered fiction and everything. This series just feels like a mess. And the reading experience is pretty uneven just because of that, because the quality is kind of, which is what you would expect. So I'm also, of course, reading every issue of the Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four. I haven't read as much Fantastic Four this past week as I wanted to. I wanted to finish this Epic Collection, and I'm not even close because it was just, this week was insanely busy. So, you know, I didn't read Fantastic Four every day like I wanted to. But, you know, it's still great. I'm in probably the best period of the Fantastic Four right now. Read the stories where The Black Panther was introduced, which are excellent stories. And right now, today, I'm going to be reading this fantastic king-sized special, which is the annual number 4, where the Human Torch meets the original Human Torch from the Golden Age. So here we learn that, yes, the original Human Torch did exist in the Marvel Universe. So all that stuff with the original Human Torch battling the Submariner, all that stuff happened in the Marvel Universe. And this is going to be cool. I'm looking forward to reading that today. I'm going to read that probably just as soon as I'm done doing this. So I should stop doing this so I could read the Fantastic Four. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.